Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a visually stunning cyberpunk masterpiece. But look, we aren't just here to talk about iconic motorcycles or spectacular explosions. We're going to peel back those neon-lit layers to reveal a profound, honestly terrifying philosophical warning about our own modern anxieties. And it's a warning that is more relevant today than ever before, especially as we stand on the absolute brink of massive technological shifts.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to structurally decode the core warnings of this story, starting with more than just cyberpunk, then moving through civilization after moral collapse, the tragedy of absolute power, science without ethical wisdom, apocalypse as a revelation, and finally ending on the post-human future. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. More than just cyberpunk, a mirror reflecting modern anxiety.
Consider this quote our North Star for this entire explainer. This story is fundamentally a philosophical meditation on what happens when human beings gain godlike power without moral maturity, social stability, or self-understanding. It's that terrifying intersection of ultimate power and human immaturity. We are talking about humanity essentially being handed the keys to the universe, right? But while still possessing the emotional maturity of a reckless teenager. And that's the theme that feels incredibly urgent right now as we navigate our own era of rapid, unchecked technological leaps.
Moving on to Section 2. Civilization after moral collapse. Neo-Tokyo's broken society.
When we examine this broken civilization, a fascinating, multi-layered picture starts to emerge. Think about Plato for a second. He taught us that a disordered city is really just a reflection of a disordered human soul. That kind of chaos breeds the exact environment Thomas Hobbes warned us about. A society so driven by underlying fear that it becomes desperate for any violent, militaristic authority just to keep the peace. Then, layer on Jean Baudrillard's idea of hyperreality, where citizens completely distract themselves with endless neon media spectacles and political riots. Finally, add Walter Benjamin's rather bleak view of history as just one long, accumulating catastrophe. Put all of that together, and Neo-Tokyo isn't just a cool sci-fi setting, is it? It's a society built on unresolved trauma, rampant consumerism, and the suffocating fear of total collapse.
And this philosophical backdrop brilliantly illustrates why characters like Kaneda and those roaming biker gangs resonate so deeply with us today. Their violence isn't just meaningless chaos or classic teenage rebellion. It represents a deeply alienated youth frantically searching for any semblance of meaning in a society that has entirely failed them. It's the raw, unfiltered anger of a generation abandoned by its own schools, government, and institutions. They're left out there to create their own brutal street-level orders simply because the adult world above them is completely morally bankrupt.
Which brings us to Section 3, the tragedy of absolute power, Tetsuo's psychological collapse.
To truly understand Tetsuo's psychological profile, we have to look at a pretty stark dichotomy. First, we have Alfred Adler's concept of the inferiority complex, deep, unhealed psychological wounds that drive a desperate need for compensation. Tetsuo starts out as the weakest kid in the gang, right? The guy who constantly needs to be rescued. But this perfectly collides with Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power and deep-seated race-timon. Tetsuo's tragedy doesn't actually begin when he suddenly gets godlike psychic abilities. It begins with profound, quiet humiliation. The immense power he gains doesn't heal his trauma at all. It literally just weaponizes his pre-existing insecurities.
This ties perfectly into Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection. If you aren't familiar, it's the absolute horror of bodily excess, vulnerability, and the terrifying loss of physical control. When you see the famous grotesque body horror in this story, where Tetsuo's flesh aggressively expands, mutates, and literally swallows the machinery around him, you are watching abjection in real time. He completely loses rational mastery over his own physical form. He transforms into a terrifying experimental battlefield of flesh and metal.
So this forces a massive, heavy question upon us. What actually happens when a human identity cannot contain unlimited power? Tetsuo doesn't simply use his new power. He is completely consumed by it. His fragile, insecure sense of self simply cannot ethically or psychologically master the incredible cosmic forces surging through his veins. It physically breaks him apart because the human vessel was just never designed to hold the power of a god.
Let's move to Section 4. Science without ethical wisdom, the reckless ambition. When we evaluate the government experiments on those psychic children, the espers, a profound moral horror is unveiled. Immanuel Kant famously warned against treating persons merely as a means to an end.
Michel Foucault highlighted the chilling dangers of biopolitics, where institutions exert ultimate, clinical control over the physical body. And Emmanuel Levinas argued for our absolute responsibility toward the vulnerable other. By completely abandoning every single one of these core principles, the state turns innocent, vulnerable humans into disposable lab rats. They entirely strip them of their human dignity, all in the name of so-called scientific progress.
Echoing thinkers from Aristotle all the way to Hans Jonas, the sweeping takeaway here is crystal clear. Science without practical, moral wisdom does not create progress. It creates catastrophe. Technological ambition, divorced from ethical responsibility, is an absolute, unavoidable recipe for disaster. When we play with forces we don't respect, the blowback is always, always devastating.
Before we hit the climax of our explainer, we really need to confront one chilling, overarching question. Can technology create gods? This narrative forces us to examine humanity's reckless desire to engineer its own transcendence. It demands we ask whether our grandest technological achievements, whether we're talking about bioengineering or artificial intelligence today, merely serve to magnify our deepest, most destructive human failures.
Section 5. Apocalypse as a Revolution. Uncovering the brokenness.
To really understand the climax of this story, we have to look at the true original definition of the word apocalypse. Drawing from its ancient roots in the book of Revelation, it doesn't just mean a fiery ending or destruction. It literally translates to an unveiling or uncovering of truth. So the catastrophic destruction of the city isn't just some cool cinematic spectacle. It is a profound unveiling. It violently exposes the deep moral rot and political corruption that was already festering just beneath the surface of everyday civilization. The explosion merely reveals what was already broken.
By synthesizing Western and Eastern philosophy here, we witness a profound, continuous cycle of destruction and creation. We start with Walter Benjamin's concept of history as nothing but accumulated catastrophe. But then, as Nietzsche argued, this total destruction actually becomes a necessary, violent condition for new creation to even be possible. Finally, rooting itself in Buddhist philosophy, we confront impermanence, the inevitable dissolution of all form. Through this incredible philosophical cycle, the apocalypse isn't just an end, it's the unforgiving mechanism that forces a stagnant, broken society to wipe the slate completely clean.
Finally, Section 6, the post-human future, evolution beyond the human.
The entity at the very center of this story is ultimately framed as an event, a massive ontological rupture in reality itself. And this touches on a massive spectrum of post-human thought. We're talking everything from Nietzsche's Übermensch and humanity's drive to overcome its own limitations, right through to the modern transhumanist dream of biological enhancement. Yet at the very same time, it embodies Heidegger's stark warnings about the profound dangers of technological thinking, all while hinting at Teilhard de Chardin's theory of a final spiritual convergence. It presents our post-human evolution as the ultimate paradox. It's both a divine, transcendent promise and a terrifying, uncontrollable nightmare.
Ultimately, destruction may indeed be creation, but definitely not in any way that humanity can easily understand, let alone control. The eventual birth of a new universe at the climax of this story suggests that reality is in a state of continual, endless becoming. It is a stark, incredibly humbling reminder that humanity is just exceedingly small in the face of true cosmic transformation. The universe is going to move on, with or without us.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative warning to reflect upon. Will humanity possess the power to become godlike before it develops the wisdom to remain humane? As we navigate our own rapidly accelerating, AI-driven, and honestly unpredictable future, this is no longer just a piece of 1980s sci-fi fiction. It is the ultimate question we must ask ourselves today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.